The danger zone, however, was not that, because from 2001 to 2008, despite those deficits, publicly held debt went from 34% to 40%. In other words, you weren't moving into levels that were in any sense risky or problematic. But the fiscal collapse that followed and the rapid rise in debt GDP to above 70%, that has created an entirely different situation. So one of the ways I think it's helpful to think about this, even though Gene is going to not like this, is that you've had a bipartisan flight from reality with respect to budget policy for a long time, especially when it comes to taxes. Democrats have been unwilling to admit that their domestic agenda requires high revenue levels that affect middle as well as upper income taxpayers. And Republicans have maintained that lower revenue levels can be kept in place with offsetting domestic spending cuts that they will somehow magically provide and that the public will somehow magically accept. And as long as you've got parties pursuing electoral strategies divorced from fiscal reality, in particular, the spending that's almost certainly going to be in place over the next decade, and the revenues needed to support that spending, to say nothing of the entitlement expansion, which then has to be confronted, you're going to have the kind of deadlock over serious budget policy that we've had, as I say, for a very long time. So if this interpretation is reasonably accurate, and obviously I think it is, you have to question whether either party is being honest about future revenue needs. And if they're not being honest, can you achieve the fiscal consolidation that everyone agrees is essential? And I thought I'd close with just a couple of little suggestive things. Because everybody says, well, what we're going to do is we're going to broaden the base. And the problem is there's a big base to be broadened. You can see it there with selected major tax expenditures, which is a nice way of talking about tax preferences. The problem is, while those are in magnitude enormous, that little list provides everything that people truly care about when it comes to provisions in the tax code. It's all the big exclusions: health care, retirement, all the major deductions, mortgage and charity. It's the preferential rates, and it's the tax credits for the poor. So which of those do you start to play with? And then finally, which is why I think you need to look about this in terms of not just the wealthy or whatever your definition is. This gives you some guidance about the broader debate, in particular the revenue cost of tax provisions for different income groups. And as you can see, the upper income provisions are substantial, nearly 1.2 trillion. This is my grouping, by the way, but it's reasonably accurate of which groups benefit from the different rates and other provisions of the 2001-2003 tax cuts. But the low and the middle income provisions are roughly equal, and when you throw in the AMT, which is essentially a middle class tax protection, what you see there is $2 trillion for low and middle income groups. So when you're talking about revenues, then you're talking about not just the wealthy in terms of what you need to sustain the spending that's likely to be in place for a very long time. So revenues are a key to all of this, and I don't think that's a part of the budget debate that receives enough attention. And the thing is, budgets are about choices. And the question really is, what are you willing to pay for? And if you want more defense, you're going to have to pay for it. And I don't know how you pay for these things except with taxes.
Okay. All right, ending on a note of reality there, I think. So let's take some questions. Start with Mickey Stewart here. Mickey, there's a microphone coming, by the way. All this is being recorded, just in case you are unaware.
Could the panel explain the Grover-Norquist phenomenon and how that will play out in the coming administration in the Congress and the budget debate?
Cal, you want to take that one?
The Grover-Norquist phenomenon is a pledge taken by almost every Republican in Congress and a significant number of Democrats never to vote for a tax increase, which Dennis just explained makes solving all of this a very difficult problem. Now, as a political electoral strategy, it's wonderful. Sells to the Tea Party, sells to the Republican primary base very, very well, but has created a situation in which we're talking about closing some of the tax loopholes that Dennis just explained are very attractive to a great many people, but standing resolutely against any increase in the marginal tax rates. And I'll simply tell you, when we're talking about increases to the marginal tax rates, what we're talking about is changes between the Clinton levels of 39.6 at the top rate and the current 35. We're not talking about going back to 70% from the Kennedy years or 90% from the Eisenhower years. We're talking about a little bit there in the middle, but currently, and it's breaking up a little bit post-election, the Republican Party has stood resolutely against any tax increase, and this is a product of Grover Norquist's work over the course of 2 decades and more. And I would note that we know and love Grover down here. He's a very close friend of Governor Perry. They vacation together. You don't want to, you know, these are the, in the Caribbean, you don't want to think of these guys in suits, but at least bathing suits, but we know Grover down here and love him.
Would anyone would anyone like to add to that on the panel? Any additions about Mr.
Anyone
Norquist?
not like Grover?
You know, it's hard to believe there's a party following somebody named Grover. I'm disconcerted by that. I truly am. He is a very strange man. His influence has been, I think the word malign is fair, and it's extraordinary that a party has marched to that drummer for as long as it has. And you would think that finally the people who finance him are going to wake up to the fact that it's not in their best interests if we keep screwing around with deficits and debt the way we've been doing.
I do
He
think,
named for Grover Cleveland. Yes.
I do think the situation is more hopeful, perhaps, my colleagues too, because I had the privilege of serving as a young analyst at the Congressional Budget Office when Alice Rivlin, as director, tried to raise this whole issue of tax expenditures. Now, that was 40 years ago, I grant. She got no traction. What's interesting to me is both sides of the aisle now, both sides of the aisle are talking about tax expenditures. And you saw Governor Romney in the campaign raise one of the kinds of ideas out there that's possible, which is honoring the politics that Dennis correctly pointed out about the specific elements and their popularity. Saying, okay, at least for certain income groups, you only get this much, some kind of limit on those expenditures. It was a golden moment, actually, which is not now remembered, although it came up in the 2008 campaign again, and the outcome was unfortunate in that specific element in terms of the stance the two sides took. When the last major tax revision took place, which is 1986, that was Bill Bradley, in my judgment, mostly Bill Bradley, and President Reagan. Senator Bradley tried to end the tax sheltering of medical care expenditures, which is one of the biggest tax expenditures in the code. And it was the one price that the Democratic Party leadership in the Congress had to pay to get it through, because the UAW specifically, remember the UAW unions had particularly generous health policies, demanded that be stricken as the price of their accepting the revision, and that happened. I do think Bradley was prophetic. We'd be in a different place, I'd argue, and there was the whole Medicare inflation picture as a country had been adopted. Now, what's interesting to me, so yes, pessimistically, McCain brings it up in 2008, Barack Obama denounces it as an idea, and so it's off the table, except it's come back in the Cadillac tax in the health bill. And so I do think there's progress on both sides there on this tax expenditure question, a recognition, while they will not admit it publicly, they've got to raise more revenue to pay for what the country wants to have. The only way to do it, you cannot keep raising rates to the margin. The historical reality is, yes, you can raise the published rates on what Professor Biller correctly calls the high income, not the wealthy. That's the state taxes and property taxes, not income taxes. You can raise marginal tax rates on the high income. They are politically and economically skilled enough to evade them de facto. And so, yes, you can raise the published rates, you don't change the take. And so there's a limit to what you can do. The only way you really get revenues up is you, in fact, involve the whole society. That's a very difficult political point. I agree with my colleagues in that matter. But I do see progress being made. The conversation has turned to what was 40 years ago a topic totally ignored.
Annie, did you have a question?
Yes, question.
Microphone.
Yes, I'd like to ask the panelists to focus on the defense budget per se. As Dr. Chu explained to us, the defense budget is maybe 3, 4, 5% of the whole national budget. But within the slice itself, just like his explanation, a big chunk of it goes to personnel cost. And a big chunk of that in particular, too, is the medical expenses. That's a growing and growing slice.
Yep.
And so how can the Department of Defense think about what are the priorities for cuts as well as priorities for maintaining a certain level or even increased spending as we look out into the future? And after all, what's a promise made is a promise kept, and I understand there are ramifications when the Army or the other services try to recruit or retain personnel, and you say that, well, we can't give you the same retirement pay that we promised you now that you're in service. But we also know that there's been a lot of outcry from service members, even with small increases in TRICARE, and also in terms of the recent rounds of BRAC. What have we learned from it in terms of finding those real efficiency gains? So perhaps a question for both Dr. Jillson and Dr. Chu, as it is both within the realm of finding the political possible and economic possibilities to make this happen. Thank you.
Well, I think the present administration has congratulated on the progress that's made on the specific issue of defense healthcare costs. Because, yes, there has been rejected in its proposal to raise the fees for TRICARE. TRICARE is the brand name for the military health program, which covers both serving military personnel, their families, and all military retirees and their families. And while they lost that battle, you might, if you were cynical, see it as a diversion, because at the same time they got a series of other changes through, including finally ending the old Siemens hospital program, which goes back a long way, which morphed in several different ways into a very expensive health care package for a very small number of people. So they've made progress. I don't think they can make too much more progress without a broader national conversation about what's the personal versus the public role in terms of financing health care expenditures, and what are the incentives we confront people with. But they have made some progress on that front.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and I think it's 3 or 4% of GDP as opposed to the budget. But I think Stephen's point about 50% of healthcare in the United States runs through the government. TRICARE is part of that. Medicare and Medicaid is part of that, and that proportion is going to grow. I do think that one of the things that did not end up in Obamacare that really should have was the element that was identified with, what is it, throwing grandma off the cliff? What was that?
Death panel.
Death panel.
Yeah, the death panel, which was a panel of federal administrators that would parse the quality of various drugs and various treatments and various pieces of equipment, how efficacious they were in actually improving health, and then paying for the best ones and not paying for others. That was challenged as getting between the patient and the doctor. But it was one of the elements of the Obamacare program that was meant to begin to hold down the growth in healthcare, which would be a good thing for TRICARE as well as for the rest of the healthcare industry.
Next question. Yes, this gentleman up here. Up here on the back row. And I'll come back down front here.
Hi, my name is Kobe Markham. I'm a student here at the university. And my question is, in our economics class, some of what we looked at was to change the tax system. One of the things that we look at is the administrative burden of the tax system. And we say there are too many people who earn their living off of that administrative burden that is created by the complications of our current tax system. And my question for the panel here is, how would you feel about starting a new tax system that is based on a certain date after which point that person is born? And those new tax system, as more people are born, would slowly graduate into those things. I think it would likely be accepted now because somebody who is making their current income off the administrative burden that's created by the complicated tax system that we do have now, it would come into effect 18 years from the time that it was instituted. And also, people who grow up under that tax system will then be voters and are most likely to defend that tax system. And some people have said, well, we need something now, and this is true, but we also need something 20 years from now. And so I'm just curious to know if that is a good idea or something that might possibly work for the future, to do something like that, to have a simpler tax system.
Dennis?
Well, it's an interesting idea. When we do tax policy, we frequently talk about a few criteria, and one of them's equity. And by most measures, progressivity in the tax system is fairly high. We talk about economic efficiency. There it's more mixed, particularly since we've done a lot to complicate matters since 1986, which is your last big tax reform. Then we get to administrative efficiency, and that's where people stop talking, because all they measure most of the time is how much it takes the government to collect, and we do reasonably well on that. There's the fourth, however, which I think is the important one, which is the purpose of a tax system is to raise revenue. There are intelligent ways to do it, better ways to do it than other ways, but you need to have some agreement about how much revenue you need in order to support the programs that you have without unreasonable levels of deficits and debt. And so revenue raising, to me, is where most of our attention should be focused. And what we can then do would be to consider administrative or other kinds of reforms that would generate those revenues in more efficient ways than we're doing right now. And that might involve some type of evolution in the way that we administer the tax system. So it's certainly something that people should talk about, but the priority right now is not going to be, quite honestly, on a major transformation of the tax system. We're not there. What it needs to be on would be the incremental increases in revenue to keep things fairly steady over the next decade.
This gentleman on the front row here, and then
Mike Higgins. This morning we talked at one point about the understanding of the third and fourth order implications of decisions that get made. Decision gets made, 2, 3, 4 circles out, things happen. In this whole process about cutting, a discussion about cutting budget for the Defense Department, whether it's the extra $100 billion we talked about at lunch or sequestration, is anyone thinking about the implications on the defense industry, the manufacturing engineering industry that supports all this, and the middle-class jobs that will of necessity go away? This administration makes a lot of noise about caring about the middle class, but de facto they're going to wipe out large chunks of jobs that are $60, $80, $90, $125,000 jobs that are by definition good middle-class jobs at the same time they cut defense spending. Is anyone thinking about that second, third, fourth order consequence? Do they care?
Well, as you know, it's been an issue in the sequestration debate as one of the immediate consequences. I think the reality is that I agree with the points others have made. The reality is, as a political matter, whether we think the resulting level of defense expenditures is right or wrong, as a political matter, we're likely to see somewhat smaller defense budgets. I think the issue is, what's the content of that budget? Can we sustain a vigorous investment portfolio? The historical record is, I would argue, not all that encouraging. So if you look at as Dennis pointed, the last big reduction was the end of the Cold War. There we lucked out. Our major opponent collapsed. There was no immediate threat to the United States, at least that we could then agree to discern. And so we took 40% of the structure away. That's a great way to save operating costs. it's still required in purchasing power of the early 90s, which is not as valuable as today, it still required a $100 billion a year cut in procurement. That's, or investment, procurement and R&D, that's a lot. And so I think the challenge going forward, if the lower defense budgets that everyone forecasts come to pass, and assuming there's no conflict, can the department deal with its political issues? The BRAC-type problem was mentioned, the healthcare issue, and so on and so forth, in a way that allows a robust investment budget. And I would argue it's particularly important. This is not an answer to your question, I would argue, because it gives me a chance to make a speech. It's particularly important because this decade's more generous defense budgets, because of the wars, did not allow for the accumulation of capital goods that the prior expansions permitted. So the Kennedy defense budgets built the fleet the United States operated for 30 years afterwards. The Reagan defense budgets built the aircraft and the vehicles that were used in Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and sustained the Air Force until the 2000s. We didn't fill up the coffers or the inventory, so to speak, in the same way in the last decade. So there's a real problem going forward, of which the most interesting symbol, I think, is going to be the struggle over who pays to replace the Ohio-class submarines. The Navy, forgive me, Admiral, is always saying that's a national program. In other words, not out of the Navy's budget.
I do think also that Congress thinks of it exactly the way you described it in terms of the jobs. But the debate above the level of Congress, before it gets to them, has to be on national strategic priorities and how we meet them. So I hope that that's the debate that we have. But once it gets to Congress, it's all about jobs in my district.
This gentleman here.
Just mention one thing. Back in 2000, CBO did a study on the effects of the 1990s defense drawdowns, retrenchment, whatever you want to call it. And they tried to come up with a comparison between what they called a sustaining budget, which was appropriate readiness and modernization, versus the budget that was in place. And the difference off of fiscal year 2000 appropriation of, I think it was $299, they estimated the sustaining budget at $349, $50 billion more. And then by category, the biggest differential, the thing that accounted for most of it, was procurement.
Okay, this gentleman here. Yeah.
Mark Friedland. It appears as if we've addressed what I would call a static view of tax and revenue, and I'd be interested in a dynamic view as to the efficacy of reducing taxes, both corporate and personal, and thereby increasing employment jobs and growing the economy over the next several years. I believe that the United States, I've heard, has either the highest or one of the highest corporate tax rates around. And we have tons, millions of dollars of cash that is sitting in corporate coffers just waiting because they have no clue what's going to happen.
Okay, I see David shaking his head. Do you want to take that one?
Well, I agree from the economist's naive, non-political perspective. It has no chance of enacting. The recommendation is move off of taxes on income, especially high marginal income tax rates, and on to taxes on consumption. Europeans have that system with value-added taxes, and that's what the many Republican Party I might acknowledge. It would be the right thing to do if you get there politically, but I would defer to my colleagues, how would you get to that? Because back to Dennis's correct point about the alternative minimum tax, here is the quintessential flat tax. Because if your income passed a certain trigger, you just pay X percent. I think 28 is the highest. Yep. Given all the enthusiasm for flat tax, why isn't there enthusiasm for fisher? But both parties denounce this. So we're stuck in this unproductive conversation where we're not willing to follow our own principles through to a large conclusion. AMT, a great way to raise money quickly, as Dennis points out. And it would be a flat tax, which I think is the right way to go. You could have one or two rates in a flat tax, but get rid of some of the complexities that your other question suggested. And think about over time how you move more toward taxing consumption as opposed to taxing income at the margin, high rates.
When we started discussing fiscal consolidation several years ago, Paul Volcker brought this up, and it gained no traction whatsoever. And it's extraordinary. The Republican opposition to this is really surprising because they just view this as a way to grow the welfare state, as opposed to an economically efficient way to raise revenues. And then also on the AMT, what is the AMT? What they do is you recalculate, as some of you unfortunately probably know, you recalculate and there are some exclusions that come out, some deductions that come out. They give you a base amount, which is 45,000, which is effectively a cap. So what you're talking about is a variation of exactly what everybody says they want, which is low rates, broader base. And it gets rejected by each party. We're now into year 12.
But if you take a long-term view, I think it's very important to have conversations like this in which people like President Ippolito raise this issue. So my example is the tax expenditure. 40 years ago, that was, you couldn't get anyone talking about it. People are now talking about it. I think we will have, my forecast is, despite the political diversity, something on that front will happen. It already has with the Cadillac tax in the health bill, which the president accepted. And probably a way to raise more revenue quickly is to start moving that number down. Corporations, as a small corporation leader, I'm very sensitive to that. I'm watching our healthcare cost package with that in mind. We do not want to have to pay that tax. So people make adjustments if you do that kind of thing. So I think starting that conversation, which might take 2 decades to reveal the result, is productive and hopeful.
But is there any truth in reducing current